Good morning, everyone, or good afternoon, or good evening to wherever you are around the world. Welcome to our colleagues and friends. We know that we have a really robust group of audience participants today, so thank you for taking the time to be with us. I'm Mike Sprega. I'm the director of the Wilson Center's Polar Institute and our Global Risk and Resilience Program. I think you will enjoy today's discussion. It is based off of a position piece that Ross Virginia and Kennan have penned entitled Realism in the Arctic. Today is the last day, the last of 5 events that have comprised the Wilson Center's Polar Week. On Monday, we convened a timely and important discussion on expansion of maritime activity in the Bering Strait region, mitigating existing and future risks. And on Tuesday, we convened a unique discussion on China's role in saving the wild Southern Ocean, creating a network of marine protected areas. Also on Tuesday, we released the inaugural edition of our new publication, Polar Perspectives, with a piece by Global Fellow Peter Carey, entitled, Is it Time for a Paradigm Shift and How Antarctic Tourism is Controlled? On Wednesday, we facilitated a wonderful discussion on Canada's new Arctic and Northern Policy Framework. And just yesterday, we explored the European Union's interest in and reasons for the development and implementation of a new Arctic strategy. And you can find all of our programs on our website. They are recorded for you to view later on. None of this could be possible without friends and colleagues, 2 in particular, A2A Railway and Algona Corporation. They make our programs possible throughout the year, and we'd like to thank them once again. And now on to our program. As I mentioned, today's program is built upon an article of the same name authored by Ken Yalowitz and Ross Virginia, published earlier this month in the National Interest, and it explored the realities of US-Russia relations, in which they argue for more robust engagement in the Arctic between the 2 countries, and that as a way of keeping tensions from rising and perhaps provide some traction for a more productive bilateral discussion later on. I'm not aware of other engagements at the bilateral level, aside from what we see out in the Arctic Council, the U.S. Arctic, the Coast Guard Forum. So this program will explore ways in which other bilateral and multilateral relationships could be ways in which the relationships between the 2 countries could somehow be accelerated in a positive manner. Excuse me. I'm joined today by a panel of 4 distinguished experts. You can find biographical information for each of them on the Polar Institute's website, but let me briefly introduce them to you. First is Ambassador Ken Yalowitz. He served as U.S. Ambassador to the Republic of Belarus from 1994 to 1997, and to Georgia from 1998 to 2001. He is a member of the Senior Foreign Service. He served as the Dickey Center's Director for International Understanding at Dartmouth College. And he's also a Global Fellow in the Kennan and Polar Institutes. Dr. Ross Virginia is the Myers Family Professor of Environmental Science and Director of the Institute of Arctic Studies within the Dickey Center, and he is at Dartmouth College. He also serves as a Global Fellow in the Polar Institute. And my colleague, Mr. Matt Rojansky at the Wilson Center, where he is the Director of the Kennan Institute, which is, in my opinion, the premier center for advanced research on Russia and Eurasia, and the oldest and largest regional program for the Wilson Center. A relevant side note, if you've not already seen Matt's interview with Fiona Hill, I would encourage you to go to the Kennan Center website and look at the interview entitled The Putin Profile, a conversation with Dr. Fiona Hill. And we're joined by Mr. Jim DeHart, the new US coordinator for the Arctic region. His appointment was announced about 48 hours ago, so we are very, very appreciative of him joining us today. Jim, as many of you know, is a career member of the Senior Foreign Service with 28 years of experience as a US diplomat. He holds the rank of Minister Counselor, and Jim's full biographical information is available on our website. And my appreciation to you all for joining us today. A quick note to our colleagues online. I trust that this discussion will encourage you to participate, so please send in your questions to the panel via email at polar@wilsoncenter.org. polar@wilsoncenter.org. The email address is also on the program description website. And I will interject your questions into our discussions in real time, so please do that. I'd like to begin today with Jim DeHart. Jim, again, congratulations on the appointment, and the staff and fellows and scholars at the center look forward to working with you. Because your position was just announced and You're new to this position. We'd like you to take a few minutes to share components of your position, areas of responsibility, and the role your office will play to advance U.S. Arctic policy. And thank you for entertaining all of those questions. Thank you so much. And I turn the virtual floor over to you.
Mike, thanks very much, and appreciate the invitation to join this discussion today, which is really a pleasure. So good afternoon to everybody out there who is listening, and happy to join these fellow panelists today. So I think this is my first public event officially since starting, and I'm on day 3 of the job. I think the Wilson Center Polar Institute makes a lot of sense for my first outing, and so I appreciate this chance. I think, and I should probably, being 3 days on the job, I should probably approach this with a little bit of humility, surrounded by people who have been working these issues for a very long time. So the office that I'm joining here is not new. It was previously established and existing, and Admiral Papp, who many will remember from several years ago, occupied it previously. But my position is new, and so I am the U.S. coordinator. It's a role that I was asked to take that is both inward facing and outward facing. And so I have a responsibility for, I think, first and foremost, ensuring that our leadership has the best advice on policy in the region. And I'll be working to ensure that through coordination with colleagues around my building and beyond in the U.S. government, and also representing state in the interagency. But the job is not interesting if all I do is Washington, and so this is an outward-facing role as well. And so I've been asked to represent the United States in appropriate fora, and with our close partners, allies in the region, and with our not so close interlocutors out there as well. Bearing in mind that we have many very talented and knowledgeable U.S. officials already playing a role on Arctic affairs, and so I want to be in the position of supporting colleagues and the work that's already being done in this building and beyond. So if you'll allow me just a few minutes, let me make a prediction, which is that people will look back a couple years from now and recognize this summer as a important pivot point in our government's approach to the Arctic, and a moment in time, I think, when we're really launching a sustained and integrated campaign and approach to an extremely important region that will be sustained. And it needs to be sustained because this region is important. And we have a lot of different interests and activities in the Arctic that need a comprehensive and integrated approach. And, so how's that for humility right off the bat? But here I'm not talking about my position, but I'm really talking about what's happening elsewhere in our government. And so I think all of you saw that our White House, our president, decided that we need to develop an effective fleet of icebreakers by 2029, and has set in motion a process to achieve that goal. I think you've seen that we've opened a new consulate in Nuuk, Greenland. And when you consider the always difficult drive for resources in our system, I think it's significant and meaningful that that our leadership has made the decision to open the consulate there in Nuuk and to increase our engagement there. We saw that Secretary Pompeo was just in Copenhagen and had a important quadrilateral meeting that included the ministers of Greenland and Faroe Islands. And so, although the Arctic wasn't the sum total of his visit with a very close ally, it was an important dimension of it, and I think speaks to our interest there. Air Force has developed a new strategy on the Arctic. You know, we could go on and on, but I think, you know, I hope the message is clear, which is that we are really strongly focused in the USG, and this will be a sustained effort. And I think, you know, a couple reasons why that is, and I hope both are pretty evident. The first is that, you know, we're seeing huge physical changes in the region and environmental changes that impact in many ways very negatively the communities there, indigenous communities and local communities throughout the Arctic. At the same time, they make the region more accessible to resource exploitation, seabed mining, tourism. You know, the Arctic is changing quickly, and it creates the physical changes, I think, raise both new opportunities but also new risks, and so we have to be responsive to those. And then the second factor I would point to is, at the same time, we've seen significant geopolitical changes. Our relationship with Russia has become more difficult, and particularly since Russia's violation of Ukrainian sovereignty in 2014, other actions, and then China's interest in playing a role as a self-described near-Arctic nation, which is a category that we don't believe exists. So these geopolitical changes are important too. I'll wrap up here, Mike, with thanks for listening, but just to maybe mention a few of my personal priorities coming into this role. Number one, to make sure that we're drawing on all the knowledge and talent throughout our system to give our leadership the best possible advice on the Arctic, and in particular for me, the Secretary of State and the Deputy Secretary. And number two, that we follow up ambitiously on the engagement that we have, including through our consulate in Nuuk, with the assistance that we've announced for Greenland, with the Faroe Islands and all of our partners in the region. And number three, since I subscribe to the Groucho Marx School of International Affairs, I believe that 80% of success is showing up. And so we always have to show up. I think we have to be at the table. We have to make our voice heard in these discussions. And so I want to make sure that we do that. So with that, let me stop, and thanks again for the opportunity to join.
Thank you very much, Jim, for that. And that is the first reference we've had to Groucho Marx in any of our Arctic or polar discussions since we created the program about 3 years ago. So thank you for bringing in Groucho. Thank you also for the depth and breadth of the introduction. I think that these are the issues that you raise, and the approach that you are taking is something that many of us in the Arctic world will embrace. And I'm sure you'll have lots of inputs being offered to you to help advance the agenda. I think many of the things you just talked about have been things that we have, issues that we have discussed, whether it's in DC or around the world. And so we will look forward to supporting the mission, but also informing it as well. We welcome you to this discussion as well. And I think it's a great preface, great preface for the discussion that we will now have, because the article that Ross and Ken authored really does look at not just the US-Russia relations, but also what's happening with other geopolitical dynamics around the world. And as we have discussed before, many of us who have been involved in Arctic discussions, whether they are private or public, have seen this, the quote-unquote Arctic exceptionalism, or the idea that the Arctic is a peaceful zone, and it still remains a peaceful zone. but what we have seen are pressures pressuring these Arctic discussions. Ukraine has come up in Arctic discussions. Crimea has come up in Arctic discussions. Syria, cyber warfare, where just a few years ago, those weren't prevalent issues, but now weigh in. And of course, China, the unknown about China's interest. And so, Ross's article and sort of the broader context is bilateral relationships, but also advancing the U.S. strategy through an Arctic lens. Perhaps I can simply just transition this discussion to you and ask you to provide a sort of foundational discussion points from the piece that you and Ross have just written.
Very good, Mike. You're kind of coming in and out, but I think you did turn it over to me, so I'm glad to pick up. First of all, I want to thank you, Matt and Ross, three very, very good friends and colleagues, for this event today by the Wilson Center and the Polar Institute. You are doing, Mike, a terrific job, putting this institute together and conducting excellent programs like the one this week. So I congratulate you. And I certainly want to wish the best to Jim DeHart. I don't think we've met in our foreign service careers, but you've had a very, very distinguished, line of assignments and have done very, very well. So I wish you all success, and you really got off to a very, very good start with your opening remarks. So welcome aboard. The op-ed that Ross and I wrote, we titled it Realism in the Arctic, and that wasn't really meant to refer to the political scientists, the difference between the realists and the liberals and the constructivists. What we meant by that title is that there is an awful lot being written about the Arctic. Some of it is exaggerated about potential for conflict, wars over resources, military buildups. Obviously, there are concerns, but I would emphasize at the outset something that you said, Mike, and that is that our military, all of us, view the Arctic as a low probability of conflict area. Nonetheless, it is an area in flux, as you have said. And I would say that it is characterized by a good deal of cooperation, but also competition, as Jim has already articulated. And it's a situation that bears close watching, and the fact that we now have a new Arctic coordinator and all the various steps that you mentioned of intensive or more intensive U.S. government involvement are all to be welcomed. But let me begin by going over some of the areas of cooperation. When Ross and I and Mike began working on this, we really had hopes, that the Arctic pretty much could be kept out of the broader geopolitical environment. That unfortunately, has not proven the case, but there are still, I would argue, and we argue, very strong grounds for agreeing, that the situation is not inalterable and that the prospects for cooperation are still very good. But the areas of cooperation, the first, of course, is the Arctic Council, since 1996. Has done an extraordinary job in promoting scientific and environmental cooperation, in the Arctic. It's expanded now to bring in permanent observers. It's the only international organization where Inuit Native peoples are right at the table, and it plays a very important role. Secondly, the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea. I wish the United States were a party to it, but it is a very important, piece of a treaty that regulates the law of the sea. The third thing I would point out is that there are no border conflicts in the Arctic. The 2016 Barents Sea Agreement between Russia and Norway resolved one of the major, border issues in the Arctic. And right now, there are not, disputed issues about borders. And by the same token, because of the exclusive economic zones granted under the UNCLOS, and also the fact that, the Arctic powers, the Arctic littoral states are land states bordering the Arctic Ocean, there are really no disputes over who owns which of the oil and gas and other, reserves. The question that is out there, obviously, is the extended territorial shelf beyond the EEZs. And those are all so far, being managed in a very peaceable, diplomatic way, with applications being made to the relevant body under UNCLOS. And again, this may be an issue in the future if one country or another may not agree with the ultimate decisions. But so far, being a former diplomat, you don't see real issues in terms of who owns what. Now, as you mentioned, Mike, the sort of the beginnings of the intrusion of the geopolitics can be traced back to 2014 and the Russian, seizure of the Crimea and the support military of the separatism in eastern Ukraine. And as a result of that, the United States and Europe, but the United States implemented sanctions that definitely, affected the Arctic in that they prohibited American companies from assisting Russian companies in oil and gas development. And for the Russians, I would emphasize at this point, that the North, the Russian Arctic, is of critical importance to them. Alaska is critical. It's one of our 50 states. But the importance of the Arctic, to Russia simply cannot be underestimated. 11% of its GDP comes from the oil, gas, the minerals there. 22% of its exports, originate, in the Arctic. Russia has a 4,000 kilometer border on the Arctic Ocean. And with the ice melting and the borders becoming more permeable, that obviously is a major concern to them. And when you add on to that also the northern sea route above Russia, they view as a critical artery, to the future in terms of economic development in the north. And also, in terms of it's an area that adds to the strategic defensive concerns of Russia. And then I would finally just mention the Kola Peninsula, in the Russian Arctic. That is the home of the Russian North Sea Fleet. It's the home of their second strike capability, a crucial military, installation and set of installations for the Russians. So you cannot underestimate, the importance of the Arctic to the Russians. We have seen already the increase in Russian military activity in the Arctic. They have restored old Soviet bases, that were left to sort of rot, after the collapse of the Soviet Union. They've created some new bases. They have created and developed new radars, new cyber capabilities. There are new ports that are being built there. The port of Sabata, which is a very important LNG export port to China and elsewhere. So for the Russians, this is an area, as I said, of critical importance in terms of their national, their national security interests. And that cannot be, ignored. The problem, of course, is where do you draw the line between what the Russians say is defense, and their argument is that NATO has aggressive intentions against the Russian Arctic, that we want to grab their assets, their resources there. And this, of course, is part of Putin's broader allegations about, about NATO and what NATO is up to vis-a-vis Russia, and also these very hostile allegations that he has made about the United States and our desire for hegemony, et cetera, et cetera. So the question then always now is, where do you draw the line, and what is sort of legitimate defensive military actions that the Russians are taking given the importance of the zone, and what is of great worry, to our military. And Jim, you mentioned, and Michael, the U.S. Department of Defense strategies, the new Air Force strategies. All of them basically say the same thing. This is an area of low conflict possibility, but we have to be careful. We have to be on our alert. We have to be sure we can, deter any potential aggression. But at the same time, we have to work with allies. We have to work to keep, the area peaceable. My final point is about, trying to keep the Arctic as much as possible out of the geopolitical arena. U.S.-Russian relations are the worst now that they've been, for a long time. And I think many of us want to see a floor under that and to see if there are ways we can move just out of, sort of confrontation and chest beating, and try to see if there are areas where we can cooperate. Obviously, arms control is number one, but I would argue, that the Arctic, because of this foundation of cooperation that's already been built, is another very strong possibility. And the timing, I think, is important. The Russians are going to be chairman of the Arctic Council beginning next year for 2 years. They have made clear that the environment and that economics are going to be very much at the top of their list. But also, I would not be surprised if they might be at least open to the idea, of broader and different types of cooperation. It's certainly worth a diplomatic shout out. The second thing that I would point out is that we're going to have presidential elections. No matter who wins this election, as Jim has already pointed out, we're going to have a lot of involvement and activity in the Arctic. And I think, the beginning of either a second Trump administration or a first Biden administration opens possibilities, for reaching out, just a bit. And the third thing is that, with the economic recession related to the virus, the steam for at least now is going out in terms of Arctic oil and gas development because of the decline in prices. This is a time, I think, where we can take a deep breath and look to see, how we might be able, to cooperate. And the three areas very quickly that I would commend, number one, as one of the sanctions, we broke off the military to military, discussions that was called the Arctic Security Roundtable. I would love to see military to military contacts, begin again. There's the risk of accidents. There's the risk of something small developing into something with unintended consequences. And I would really love to see the resumption, of mill-to-mill contacts. We have a disagreement with the Russians on the Northern Sea Route and also the Canadians on the Northwest Passage as to whether these are internal waterways or international, waterways under the law of the Sea Convention. And I think it would be good, to sit down perhaps and talk about our differences there. And then the third thing that I would like to see is talk about an incident at sea or a code of conduct for our, particularly the naval forces, up in the Arctic. We have come close to accidents, in terms of the air in contingents, both Russian and US, some of the Arctic. And we, I think, really need to talk about measures to prevent unintended conflict. So let me stop there. Thank you.
Ken, thank you very much for that overview. I appreciate that. Ross, let me invite you into the discussion and pick up on Ken's comments and background.
Excellent. Well, thank you, Mike. It's always a real pleasure to work with close colleagues and friends on a topic that's interesting, important, and complex. That's something that draws us into this. Jim, welcome to the Wilson Center, but more importantly to your appointment as U.S. coordinator for the Arctic region. I think all of us in the Arctic community look forward to working with you and your colleagues to ensure a secure and sustainable future for Arctic people. So welcome to the team. Ken has really nicely summarized the situation today in the Arctic, which is this mix of cooperation and increasing competition between the two great powers. We are experiencing increased political uncertainty in this relationship. At the same time, we see the Arctic stressed by global warming, a severe economic downturn, and a global pandemic. This is really a unique trifecta of challenges placing the Arctic much more centrally on the world stage. So these challenges call out for international collaboration, and as I'm going to stress, investments in research. I'm the science guy on the panel. So the question for us today is, can the US and Russia wall off the Arctic from this messy set of international geopolitical conflicts? And can we make progress on a more defined set of northern initiatives? So let's try to explore that. In thinking about this talk, I went back and reread Gorbachev's speech in Murmansk 33 years ago, October 1, 1987, where he laid out the concept of the Arctic as a zone of peace. And I encourage people to do that. It's quite informative. He had sort of 6 key points here. And this was really an attempt to, from the side of Russia, or the Soviet Union coming unglued at that time, a possible shared agenda. And we've made progress in a lot of these areas, and more work needs to be done. He speaks of restricted military activities and scaled down actions in the Baltic, Northern, Norwegian, and Greenland seas, and promoting confidence building measures in those areas. The cooperation between Arctic Coast Guards, I think, comes to mind now as something that's been realized. He speaks of cooperation on resource development and technology transfer, so open economies. Talks about, this is fascinating, organization of an international conference on Arctic scientific research coordination, leading to something that he calls an Arctic Research Council. Well, I think the Arctic Council has really come together in that same kind of vision. So that's in many ways been accomplished. He mentions environmental protection, management, and also opening of the Northern Sea Route. So he was already forecasting the importance of managing the Arctic and the Arctic oceans and seas as an important, both national, but also international resource. So I'm going to jump now to what's coming ahead. The Russian Federation is going to take over the chairmanship of the Arctic Council in 2021. And Minister Lavrov has stated the consolidation of the international community's efforts to develop the far north is the key to the success of the Arctic's sustainable development. So it's clear that Russia is speaking towards environmental protection, sustainable development, new technologies, and they've also signed on to focusing on Arctic inhabitants, including indigenous peoples, and that the importance of these interactions should be stressed throughout their forthcoming chairmanship. So, as outlined here, the general thrust of the Russian chairmanship is well in line with previous chairmanships and with ongoing activities within the Arctic Council. Of course, the devil's in the details and the execution, but the signals coming out at the higher levels are encouraging, and we should be thinking about how to take advantage of them. So I would like to posit that sort of international projects and programs that promote research, the exchange of scholars and students, all working fairly quietly behind the scenes, will help the US and Russia achieve their goals around these policy agreements potentially, the design and conduct of action research on pressing human needs, and actions that are so desperately needed to confront the health and living disparities facing Arctic indigenous communities. So throughout this amazing Arctic Center, the Wilson Center's Week of the Arctic, and Mike is very prone to these week-long events, and I appreciate the continuity and the depth of these dialogues, because actually one builds on another. And so we've heard a lot about the Arctic Council this week. So what I'd like to do is maybe jump over that a little bit and talk about other examples, how the academic community is working with governments and non-governmental organizations, groups like the Wilson Center, to help sustain the Arctic as a zone of peace. Mike and I have a long history of working in some of these organizations. The first one I just want to mention and make sure people are aware of is the University of the Arctic. It's a cooperative network of universities, college, research institutions, indigenous organizations that are focusing on education and research in and about the North. UArctic started in 2001 with maybe 30 members from across the Arctic. There are now over 200 member institutions that collaborate on research and education initiatives and public outreach. And the group now has observer status in the Arctic Council. It's a virtual university. Its job is to foster collaboration and leverage resources among various institutions across the Arctic to focus on action-based research that applies to solving problems, permafrost loss, community health and well-being, fisheries, cold regions, engineering, even things like a Model Arctic Council program for youth engagement in the policy process. So UArctic is taking on, with relatively modest resources, these huge challenges and bringing together people from the US and all the Arctic nations. Of the 200 members right now, 52 are in Russia, 30 in the US. So clearly the US and Russia, through networks like UArctic, can accomplish a lot. And it may be not as visible, but it's there and it's constructive. And it may be the kind of forward progress we need when other US-Russia issues grab the headlines. We can work together steadily in this kind of forum. Another great example is one of my loves and one of Mike Sprega's is the Fulbright Arctic Initiative. We were fortunate enough to be co-lead scholars for the first 2 rounds of this program. This is a US State Department program in collaboration with the Fulbright Foundation offices across the Arctic. And we've brought together scholars and practitioners, put them in teams who work together over an 18-month period. And these are interdisciplinary teams. They design applied research to focus on policy challenges facing the Arctic nations. Russia's been engaged in this program. The US has provided leadership and resources, in particular along with Canada and Finland. So these scholars have done amazing cross-cutting research and shared it with policy advisors in their home countries on pressing issues around Arctic environment, Arctic peoples, sustainable economies, you name it. The Fulbright Arctic Initiative scholars have gone there and will continue to go there. So what happens in the Arctic, as we know, has profound and palpable effects on the rest of the world. Accelerating climate change, sea level rise, these are all the issues where we need science and more science and science cooperation. One urgent need right now is improving climate forecasting. It's extremely important for the Arctic itself and the world. We need clear research findings will offer a sound scientific basis for future political decisions regarding environmental protection, sustainable economic development, and global cooperation about the Arctic. So we've just completed the largest ever international research program in the Arctic, and it was called Mosaic. Probably a lot of you saw news of this going on. Basically, the international community locked an icebreaker in the floating sea ice and stayed out there for many months, looking at the atmosphere, looking at ice conditions, looking at changes in the oceans, so that we could have a better integrated view of the future of the Arctic and our climate system moving ahead. Mosaic, you know, every Arctic science project has to have an acronym. So Mosaic stands for the Multidisciplinary Drifting Observatory for the Study of Arctic Climate. It doesn't really roll off the tongue, but Mosaic seems to work pretty well. So what's the recipe for a major international science project of this magnitude? Well, first you need multinational support for about a 10-year planning window. So that's where governments come in and policy comes in. Mix in 5 icebreakers, 2 from Russia, 1 from Germany, 1 from Sweden, and China's new snow dragon. Note the U.S. is lacking here, but I'm glad to hear that is being addressed, and Jim mentioned that in his opening comments, that the U.S. is committed to an expanded icebreaker fleet, which will make it easier for us to be more engaged directly in some of these projects, particularly in logistics. So Mosaic has pulled together 20 nations working together, 300 scientists over many months coming and going to do this work. I think what's really important about the Mosaic project is the key to success for these international initiatives, and that is transparency. Data sharing and mobility are absolutely central to the success of these efforts. The Arctic Science Cooperation Agreement is an important binding international platform that we need to keep addressing and expanding and fine-tuning so that we make it easier for scientists to move between countries and share information and engage more directly with the policy communities. So those are 3 organizations or types of activities: expanded international science, important networks like UArctic and the Fulbright Arctic Initiative. Those are areas where relatively modest investments, I think, will pay off in sustaining a productive relationship between the US and Russia. Not quite 2 weeks ago, General David Goldfein, the Air Force Chief of Staff, speaking at the announcement of the Air Force and Space Arctic Strategy, made this comment. And he was talking about particularly the US-Russia relationship. Are there areas of common interest we can find above the 66th parallel that perhaps we were not able to find below to the south? And I believe so. Also, he says, if we're sophisticated in our dialogue with Russia, there has to be a few areas of common interest that we can find where we can be better together than we are separately. I think we can already demonstrate this is true, but we need to do the hard work to sustain this and grow this relationship. So thank you, Mike, and everyone for the time, and I look forward to our discussion.
Thank you, Ross, for going through that. There's been a wonderful bridge between some realities here, the posture and position of the Russian Federation in the Arctic, the way in which that is read by the United States and other nations, the outside forces pressuring and influencing the discussions and the positioning of the Arctic nations related to other geopolitical tensions around the world, but yet both you and Ken reinforce the fact that there is ongoing cooperation and the need to build upon that to counter the conflicts that we see elsewhere. Matt, ask you to join the discussion, and then Jim, I'm going to ask you to join as well. Matt, you work on these issues, the broader context, each and every day, both related to Russia, but also Eurasia and the broader region. I wonder if you would just provide for us your thoughts on what you have heard here today on Ken and Ross's piece, but also this issue of we do have competing interests, yet there are seeds and threads of cooperation between the two nations, and how important that might be for future relations.
Thank you very much, Mike, and congratulations to you, Jim. Thank you for being with us, and Ken and Ross. Just I respect enormously and appreciate the work that you continue to do, and I'm honored to have even a couple of minutes to offer some perspectives. I do want to pick up a couple of points that you have made. When I heard Ken refer to linkage to other issues like Ukraine or Syria, presumably also election interference, sanctions, always tip of the tongue with the Russians, but coming up in Arctic discussions, there is a certain novelty to that. But on the other hand, and certainly, the practicing diplomats on this panel will recognize that linkage is a reality. It's a reality of the human experience. To try to kind of wall off any space in our relationship entirely from what is going on elsewhere in that relationship may not be realistic. So what I want to do is try to encourage this panel to think together, to bring all of the issues together and find a way forward that is neither we have to fix everything in order to make progress anywhere, nor let's pretend we don't have problems, define a kind of magical space where the normal rules of kind of human distrust and zero sum and bitterness and resentment and looking for asymmetric leverage and all the things that happen in relationships and that are certainly happening now between the United States and Russia. If we presume that those rules won't apply in the Arctic because there's something magical about it or because that's the way it always used to be, I think, unfortunately, we're going to be caught out unprepared for a new reality that's going to settle in pretty quickly, and it won't be a pretty one. In terms of sanctions, one of the issues to be wary of here, and again, I offer these things not prescriptively but descriptively, is to ask yourself, what have the sanctions targeted, right? They have principally targeted energy extraction, energy services, shipping, project finance, pipelines. Well, guess what? What is that Arctic economy that Mike and Ken and Ross have all referred to for the Russians? It's all of those things. And again, just sort of as an observation, the more important that Arctic economy is to Russia, the more incentive US and Western policymakers looking to exert leverage on Russia will have to sanction those things. And I view that simply as a statement of fact, right? It's not an argument that there should be more emphasis on that or there should be less, that we should give them a pass in this area. It's simply a question of incentives. The more Russia develops and pursues its Arctic resources, the more attention will come to those as a way of exerting leverage on Russia. And in the current sanctions dynamic we're in, that's likely to lead to more conflict and make it harder for us if we want to separate out that Arctic conversation. And more generally, I think if you look at recent US-Russian experience, or you can go back even several decades, I think it's fair to ask the question in a generalizable sense. Is it possible to wall off areas of this relationship? The Arctic certainly was an example I would have pointed to a decade ago, or even as recently as 6 or 7 years ago. I think some of the points that have been made here today raise the question of whether that is still the case. Mike, you and I were together at a meeting not so long ago with officials from all sides involved, and it may have taken place in a charming and very wealthy city in the south of Germany round about February, and I was shocked. I was just shocked at how different the tone among the officials was on the Arctic. It sounded exactly as if they were talking about almost anything else. So I question almost just on a psychological and human level, is it possible to do the walling off? And then I look at the other example that I would always, it was my go-to example, space cooperation, right? I mean, hey, we did the Apollo Soyuz, then we did the International Space Station together, and it was even true a couple of years back, we had an American astronaut and a Russian cosmonaut, spinning around the Earth together for a year, the Year in Space project. And these things are so promising. And I won't say that space cooperation has collapsed, right? We're still doing launches together. The ISS is still holding together. But I think it would be fair to call it a partial success because it hasn't stopped a trend toward militarization of space, and it hasn't stopped the collapse of the broader arms race or the collapse of the broader arms control infrastructure, of which preventing space militarization through peaceful space cooperation was supposed to be an instrumental part. So, at best, a partial success in attempting to wall off an area of the relationship. In general, I think it's fair to say that the politics and the psychology of this relationship have shifted from what would have been, you know, in the heyday either of the late Cold War or of the 1990s into the 2000s, something along the lines of trust but verify, right? A kind of sober-minded, interests first cooperation with careful verification, to, you know, pretty reflexive mutual demonization and explicit attempts at bludgeoning and mutual isolation, on the theory that total victory is possible, right? An abandonment of the basic premise of diplomacy, to use Kissinger's maxim, you know, you got to know what we want, what the other guy wants, and what can we live with, right? The idea that there's going to be some midpoint that we're going to come to where we each get a little bit of what we want, but we have to make some concessions. We don't seem to be in that frame of mind between the US and Russia anymore. I'll simply just, a quick point on what Ken pointed out about the degree, the stake that Russia really has in this region. That should be a positive dynamic, right? It should be the fact that Russia is so heavily invested in the Arctic, relative to the United States, at least, right? And we're moving in that direction. That's very good. But that raises the problem of asymmetry. Asymmetry in this relationship has been very difficult to make parity that maintains stability. I think very real asymmetries, right? You know, a 20+ economy, right? A global, you know, American military, which is, you know, very capable, but still fundamentally a regional actor. These kinds of asymmetries have created incentives, in particular on the Russian side, effectively, provocatively, and in order to catch a stronger adversary off guard. And I think what is that there are significant asymmetries, and I'll bring in China in just a second, where I think those asymmetries are others. I think Europe has to be first on the list. You know, I'm sure Europe was covered in the course of this week of the Arctic, but I'd like to talk about it in the Russia context, because this is where I also see a danger, a very significant divergence, not necessarily on the Arctic portfolio, but on the broader Eurasian power entente of Russia and China. It's very clear that the Europeans have a different set of interests, and that they themselves are not necessarily questioned what degree is the European Union bilaterally with each of our, they happen to all be European allies, but European ally, the European factor in this, because if we're not managing it, I can guarantee you that the Russians will be managing it, and will be doing so to their advantage. And then China, as I mentioned. I mean, we are now fully engaged in an era of what has been called great power competition. With the United States and China being kind of the principal great powers there. I think rather than a reversal of the Kissinger, you know, the so-called reverse Kissinger, instead of reaching out to China, to then more people have suggested, well, if we can repair the relationship with Russia, contain China. In fact, what's actually happening now, such that Russia and China are reaching out to one another, is going to be the Russians, you know, in a sense, inviting the Chinese in a way that the Chinese have been waiting at the door and wanting for a very long time. But they will certainly do so in ways the other side of the Arctic Council would like to see it happen. But then to end on maybe a little more hopeful note, I picked up at least 4 points, and I think there were a lot more Ross and particular have some great examples, so to speak, behind all of these ideas, care about the shared environment of the Arctic. There is no better moment than when ordinary Russians, I'm not even talking about the Kremlin, I'm talking about ordinary Russians are furious and they're protesting about Arctic thing, about historic temperature fluctuations and the environmental pollution that's resulting from all of those things. That's an opportunity. It's not an opportunity to try to score points against the Kremlin, right? Because that'll be counterproductive. It will backfire in our face. But it is clearly an opportunity for Americans who share a concern to band together with Russians and not let this be the stuff of kind of the fringe political opposition. This can be the stuff of the relationship writ large. I think COVID underscores the universality of public health concerns, and nowhere more so than the Arctic, where you have not only the universal risks of contagion and airborne diseases and things like that, but you have unique challenges that are related to a changing climate, the kinds of microbes that can flourish in a permafrost melt environment. You have native community health concerns, access to healthcare, and the opportunity of telemedicine and telecommunications. And there, I think a huge question is going to be whose infrastructure and whose rules. So if we're building advanced telecommunication infrastructure in the Arctic, as we should be doing, the 5G and the whole set of related questions. Commercial traffic, right? I love the idea that, I like flipping the kind of icebreaker arms race on its head and saying, look, the more the merrier, the more parties that have capabilities, the more they can contribute those capabilities. But that is a fundamental, go to Capitol Hill with that message. Jim, I hope you can do that, right? That's a fundamental reversal of the way that we have been talking about the icebreaker race up to now. Mike is nodding. I know we've had that conversation. And then finally, the research agenda. This one I love. I don't know if you guys are aware, but just this week, the US Academy of Science and the Russian Academy of Science signed a cooperative memorandum to do joint research on COVID. It's taken long enough, but it's good that they're doing it. And to my mind, this is a far better pattern than, accusing one another of sending each other dysfunctional ventilators for an inflated price. So I think that the research agenda, letting scientists be in the lead, is extremely promising. And I don't know if any of that's been helpful, but I'll end it there. Thank you.
Matt, thank you very much. That has been extraordinarily helpful. I will tell you that we had some tough connections there with you, but we'll peek back with you because you had a number of outstanding comments and we'll want to capture that again. I'm going to do, in the football terms, an audible here in real time. This has been such a good discussion, and we have not talked about this as panelists, so this is really in real time, but we have the ability to go another 30 minutes or so. I know others have a lot of other appointments and things to do. What I would like to do, because I have, 4 dozen, maybe more questions that have come in, and we still have not brought Jim in. So I'm wondering in real time, if you all could stay with us, the panelists can stay with us for any fraction of that 30 minutes. Jim, I'm particularly staring at your box because I know you might have a thing or two to do. But if each of you could just give me a thumbs up, if you can hang out for another 30 minutes with us, I'd like to be able to, that's okay. I've got thumbs up from most everyone. Matt, Matt's got a okay. So let me just talk to John Tyler in the broadcast booth to let John know that we're going to go for another 30 minutes or whatever component that we want to use. Jim, thank you for allowing us to impede on your day. I would like to then go forward with many of the components, Jim, that Matt just brought up. I think he did a nice job of weaving that together and putting in a larger context, and ask for your response to any of the questions or issues that the panelists raised, including Matt's fantastic analysis and review. And take that wherever you'd like to, please.
Okay. Yeah, Mike, thanks. Happy to do so. And so let me make some comments that I think will touch on issues raised by Ken, Ross, and Matt, as well as yourself. So first of all, I think that our goals are well understood, which is we want this to be a peaceful region where there's no threats to our homeland, where there is good sustainable economic growth that is supportive of the local communities, indigenous communities, and adheres to high standards in terms of good governance, transparency, environmental protections, and we aim for a region where there's close cooperation among the Arctic states and adherence to a rules-based order. I liked Matt's crystallization of whose infrastructure and whose rules. I think that's a good way to frame the question. So I've raised a couple challenges already, I guess, to our goals that I've laid out, and I think Russia and China both pose some challenges to these goals, and I think they're very distinct. They're in very different places, and so I think we have to address those challenges a bit differently. Russia is an Arctic nation. That they occupy a good portion of the Arctic. They are a member of the Arctic Council. We have that history of cooperation with Russia in that context. And there's been some very good cooperation that continues, and it's imperative, when you look at the research and the science and search and rescue, disaster management, and so forth. This is important, real cooperation with a real impact that has to continue. But this with Arctic exceptionalism, and is it possible to completely wall off the region from the challenges that we have with Russia? And I don't know if we can do that completely. I would agree that I think there is probably less chance that we would see the beginning of a conflict in the Arctic. There is perhaps more likelihood that if conflict emerged elsewhere, it could spread to the Arctic. When you look at the inextricable link, I think, between the Arctic and the North Atlantic, and in terms of how we plan for the defense of our allies in Europe. And so I think complete separation is very difficult in practice, particularly in a real life scenario, where reality may intervene on our desires. But certainly the goal is there to keep the Arctic as a zone of cooperation, and the Arctic Council, I think, being the preeminent forum for that, where that takes place. And I really have no doubt that we will continue that approach with Russia in the context of the Arctic Council. And there's a lot of important work we can do there. I had the experience too in my 3 years in Norway of being able to support a lot of the research, and particularly education programs, the Fulbright scholars, other Arctic scholars working in the region. Anybody who has worked in that domain, I think the enthusiasm of the work and the enthusiasm that people feel towards the Arctic inevitably rubs off. There's just there's sort of a boundless enthusiasm for everybody who's working in that domain, and met a number of Russian scholars as well along the way. Turning I'll just very briefly to China, which is a whole different kind of challenge, I think, because we need to see a region that continues to uphold high standards of conduct, of investment, particularly when it comes to key infrastructure. And when you look at China's practices and approaches in the rest of the world, it doesn't give one great confidence when they take an interest in areas of the Arctic, and so if they bring the approaches they've brought to much of the rest of the world, that's a serious issue for us, and I think it's a serious issue for our close allies and partners in the region. So we have to be we have to be vigilant there, and we will be working with everybody in the region that has an interest. So I hope I've addressed at least some of the thoughts that came up, and certainly in no way comprehensively, but I should stop there. Thanks.
Yeah, Jim, thank you very much, and thank you all for, again, doing another 30 minutes with us or so. I really do want to get to some of these questions. Jim, maybe I can funnel the first set of questions to you, and I'm going to just put them into one subject, because I have a lot of questions from the state of Alaska, as you might imagine, and then there are numbers for Ken, Matt, and Ross. But let me try to coalesce all of the Alaska questions into one. A lot of them, appropriate so, have to deal with your plans to engage, with the indigenous peoples of the state of Alaska, and that is not one column of peoples, very different peoples throughout our state, different leadership structures. So there's questions as to your plans to engage with communities who actually live the lifestyle that many of us talk about. 2 is to have consultation with the many groups across our state as you form U.S. policy. 3 is the role of the indigenous communities in the state of Alaska as we're thinking about international engagement. As we think about, of course, we see the Arctic in the circumpolar context, not a north-south and east-west. And so there are indigenous groups, as we know, the permanent participants to the Arctic Council. So I guess the questions that I'm trying to put together on the third point is, what role do our indigenous communities in the state of Alaska and from other nations, what role in shaping U.S. policy, and how do they participate in these international dialogues? And I hope that wasn't too much, but I probably put about 12.5 questions into 3 different buckets.
Yeah, thank you, Mike. So we are an Arctic nation, of course, and we're talking here of our fellow citizens in Alaska. I had the chance to visit Alaska a few years back to talk about, of all things, Afghanistan. So I need to get back there on my new responsibilities. I'm looking forward to doing so. You know, COVID is horrible for so many reasons, and you know, certainly one of the reasons is because it makes our jobs awfully boring when we can't get out and meet people and you know, where they live and where they work, to hear their experiences firsthand. You know, so it's the people who live in the region who are the true stakeholders, and I'm sure that people who live in the region don't want decisions made over their heads, or discussions to take place without their being able to add their voice to the discussion. I think it's really significant that in the Arctic Council, the permanent participants sit at the main table, and they're not in the background with the observers, but they're there at the main table alongside the governments, and I think that's proper. You know, so in this time of change and physical change and geopolitical change, where things are, you know, are fluid, and there are impacts that are really significant for people's lives. I think, you know, we've got to be aware of those. And so I think all I can say at this stage is I look forward to getting around when I'm able to be, you know, another U.S. official who can hear the reality of what's happening on the ground.
Thank you, Jim. And I'm sure the invitations will come, certainly from the state, but also the many leadership organizations within the state of Alaska. And it'd be nice to have you here in our state, be well received. I want to follow up on a number of things, maybe in another bucket, to try to help with these questions. And that is, for all of you, we've talked a lot about the need for military to military dialogue at perhaps a more involved level. number of questions about the role of NATO as maybe that convening or that forum to have these kind of Arctic military to military discussions. So there's a lot of questions about the role of NATO there. There's questions about how you could actually bring military to military discussions together. And more importantly, there are many questions about what would they talk about. And so, Ken, Ross, maybe I could start with you. You know, it's one thing to put a forum together, but if you actually have agreement to come together in an Arctic, you know, chiefs of defense kind of structure, there best be an agenda, and what might that be? So maybe I'll put that to Ken and Ross, and then Matt, following up on your work that you do. I think there's a dovetail between the work that you do in some of these areas and how that might help to influence this discussion. Ken?
Yeah, thanks, Mike. First, I just, you know, in response to Matt, I just want to be clear that I never have believed, you know, that the Arctic can be isolated from these broader geopolitical issues. And I outlined since, you know, the events of Ukraine, you know, that, you know, is certainly not the case. What I've been arguing for is not to let the baby go down the drain with the bathwater. Have a foundation of cooperation, and that in the face of all of these often very exaggerated press assessments of imminent conflict or resource wars, I simply wanted to say that we needed to, you know, to view this in a realistic, balanced way, in which the geopolitical tensions of which, you know, the armament on both sides are of concern, you know, perhaps could be kept, you know, in some type of balance. And that goes to your point, Mike, about there was something called the Arctic Security Forum, which again, we and the Canadians and others stopped participating in after Ukraine. But that brought together very high-ranking, you know, military to sit around the table. And as I said, I think we've seen in Syria, I hate to use Syria as an example, but there is an example in Syria where the US and the Russian military, you know, are at least in contact to deconflict and prevent a real tragedy. And we've come close on a couple of occasions. But what I would want to see, and what we said in the op-ed with the mill-to-mill context, is to try have the Russians explain what the heck their objectives are, you know, which are of concern, you know, to us, and for us to explain on our side. And I think this is something that we cannot ignore, you know, that we are taking steps too. Our Air Force presence, you know, in the Arctic is very strong, very powerful. We are developing, as you know, as Jim said, you know, our plans are to create an icebreaker fleet. We're also doing maneuvers. The Secretary of State has been very vocal about criticizing Russia and China, you know, in terms of what their objectives, you know, may be in the Arctic. And it just strikes me as a former diplomat that, you know, by having the military at a high level talk to each other, that we might be able, I'm not saying we're going to solve anything, but at least we'll get a better understanding of where the other side is coming from. And going back to Matt, your citation of that wonderful Kissinger, you know, expression, to see whether or not, you know, there is anything in the middle. You know, are there ground rules here? Can we have a, you know, a code of conduct? You know, can we have an incidents at sea? Can we take steps to control, you know, the impact of these political, geopolitical, you know, efforts or geopolitical events that are impacting the Arctic?
Thank you, Ken. Ross, do you want to follow up on that? And then Matt, I'll ask you to jump in.
Sure. Yeah, just a few reactions or comments. I'm not a political scientist, so I feel I can say almost anything here and see what the reactions are. But no, I'm curious about what people think about the role of Russia as, its chairmanship of the Arctic Council, and whether that is an incentive that can be sort of recognized or worked with. To what extent does Russia want to be viewed as successful in leading this forum and the kinds of products and outcomes that come from that? Or is the Arctic Council really not as essential to Russia as perhaps some of us from the outside might think that it would be? I think the U.S. made great progress during its chairmanship program. It took a lot of pride in that, and I think the other nations that have succeeded us have approached it in the same way. So I am going to be curious to see what Russia does in that vein, and whether or not that opens opportunities for dialogues, either publicly or privately, that might be useful. The other piece here is, as a scientist, there's some discussion about whether the Arctic Council should take up security-related issues, and that's been spoken openly by a couple of Arctic nations. I personally am somewhat disturbed by that, because I think you can make the argument that, well, maybe that is the forum to bring these things together. But it's also potentially driving an even deeper wedge around those selected areas where cooperation is occurring, and perhaps less publicly, but very importantly to the future of the Arctic. So those are two comments that I'd like to put out there for discussion.
Mike, may I just say one other thing, because I didn't address that question of NATO. Again, just looking at this realistically, the idea of a NATO-Russian dialogue, I think, on the Arctic is probably a non-starter. The Russians, look upon NATO with great concern and hostility, and I think it would basically be a non-starter. In terms of the security dialogue, as I say, I think this idea of resuming the Arctic Security Roundtable would be a good first step. Following from that, I would like to see perhaps another body, not part of the Arctic Council, but would be tasked with broader security, sort of hard security discussions. But start with the Arctic Security Forum.
Thank you, Ken and Ross. I'll just make a note before I ask Matt to jump in, then come back around to Jim. Is that, as Matt noted, we were involved in a discussion a few years ago, and the Wilson Center has been helped to facilitate these kind of discussions in a region Matt noted before. And I can say that there's a lot of discussion about bringing together high-level military representatives to have discussions in a way to incrementally get to where I think you are both suggesting we go, and that is to have more normalized discussions, military to military. And I agree that Arctic Council, in my opinion, is not the place to do that. And I do think that it would be a very tough haul to have a NATO-based discussion when there are the feelings that we know the Russians have about NATO, which is a segue into Matt. Matt, I really would appreciate your thoughts on this subject as well.
Yeah, thanks, Mike. What I wanted to add, I don't disagree with you, Ken, that a NATO-Russia dialogue on the Arctic right now, as such, if you brought that proposal to the Russians, or for that matter to NATO, it's a non-starter. But that's mostly for reasons of kind of and the inertia of the path that we're on right now. I think one of the interesting aspects of what Jim said to us, and I think his assessment is exactly correct, is that the Arctic is not going to be the inception of an escalating Russia-West confrontation, but it will be a theater of one. And it seems to me that if you look at the history of US-Soviet and US-Russian security dialogue, that usually that dialogue begins from one end or another end of a conflict spectrum. Either it begins from a place of, hey, sort of what Bush and Gorbachev referred to as a New World Order, right? Moscow and Washington can get together and resolve a conflict in the Middle East because we're essentially both third parties to it, and we don't want to see superpowers get dragged into it, right? That's one sort of, you could call it, it's high stakes, but it's not, you know, the two of us staring each other down with weapons drawn. The other end of the spectrum is essentially U.S. Soviet and then U.S. Russian nuclear arms control, following the Cuban Missile Crisis and other near disasters in the relationship, seeking to avoid direct escalation between the two, knowing that it could lead spiral very quickly out of control. The question that I would ask, you know, Jim, and I would encourage us all to think about is, where do we locate the set of Arctic security issues on that conceptual spectrum? Is it a set of issues where Russia and the United States can, with some degree of impartiality, kind of broker a management of security questions? So, for example, I view transit and commerce issues in the Arctic that can certainly raise security implications as possibly in that area. At the other end of the spectrum, are there, although it may not be the main concern, are there areas of such deep disagreement that they could themselves provoke escalation to the ultimate threat, which is, of course, nuclear annihilation? If we have either of those two spaces to work with, there is a precedent for the US and Russia having serious security dialogue. I'm concerned that if it's unclear, or if it's somewhere kind of mushily in the middle of, yeah, it's linked to a dangerous and dysfunctional US-Russia relationship, but it's not exactly clear how, trying to have a discrete security dialogue about the Arctic between Americans and Russians is not going to get us anywhere.
Thank you, Matt. Jim, follow-up thoughts on that?
Good, yeah, thank you. Well, and here I am fortunate to fall back on my 3 days on the job as a way to avoid a completely authoritative statement, I guess, on some of these questions. But look, so for, you know, dialogue with Russia, here would be my initial thoughts. I think, you know, first off, we have to have the necessary communications in place, I think, to avoid a mishap, right, that could lead to conflict where neither side is looking for that. So I think those mechanisms have to exist, as they do between our close allies, I think, also in the and the Russians. But I think beyond that, we have to think really carefully about this. We have to consider whether restoring contacts in some domain would serve a Russian interest in returning to a business as usual approach. You know, at a time where we have real unresolved issues that we need to try to address with Russia. That would be the first thing. The second question I think we'd have to consider is, you know, does creating or extending a new channel or forum for discussion of security with Russia, is that a conversation that they would approach constructively, or would we simply be giving them an additional voice into matters of security that we may wish instead to discuss with our close allies and partners? I think we have to be very deliberate in choosing the channels and the fora because of our current challenges. And, you know, through NATO, of course, we spent years seeking to develop a constructive dialogue with Russia through various means over a number of years. And of course, we're in a different place now than we were back then. You know, but I think we have to make sure that such a dialogue serves our interests. The Russians can't choose it, but we'll have to agree on it together, and bearing in mind those cautionary points.
Thank you, Jim. We've got about 6 minutes left, so let me again try to combine. There's about 7 or 8 questions in this one, and Jim, it's mostly to you, but I would like all the panel to respond to the question before I wrap up everything. and that is that should we not, I'm paraphrasing here, but should we not focus our efforts, our meaning US efforts, our efforts on more of the cooperative themes that have been teased out here, the Arctic Coast Guard Forum, the Arctic Council, the Bering Strait Agreement between the United States and Russia on managing that lane. Should we not put more effort into that as additional, trust building measures, and leave the dialogue about military to military as a backseat and see how that evolves based on a more productive and fruitful role of coordinating and participating and cooperating in already established fora, mechanisms, and as a way to try to get to, quote unquote, a more normalized relationship, and leave this sort of idea of creating a military to military and let that sort of to the side and let it organically build upon what we hope would be a more reinforced relationship between the two. I've just paraphrased a whole lot there, but is that the best way to address this conflict narrative and go more to the cooperation, which hopefully addresses the conflict issue? Is that the way?
Oh, Mike, are you coming back to me or panel?
Yes, I was, but then also the panel as a wrap up.
Yeah, I mean, I think I think for the time being, the channels of cooperation that we have, mainly through the Arctic Council, I think are working well. The search and rescue, I know we've got Coast Guard cooperation in there, and I think there's areas that we could build there. But I think that in the same way that I think the Arctic is not necessarily the region where we could experience conflict with Russia. It's more likely elsewhere. I also don't think that we can solve our problems with Russia through the Arctic. So I think we have to keep that in a certain amount of perspective. But let me stop there in case colleagues have additional thoughts.
Great. Ken, perhaps I'll call on you. We've got about 4 minutes left.
I may be alone here, but I have felt for some time, that resuming the mill-to-mill contacts in this Arctic Security Forum, would be a good idea. This in no way confers any sense that we're overlooking what the Russians have done elsewhere. But what to me it reflects is what our military seems, and everyone seems to be concerned about, is what are the goals of this Russian military buildup, in the Arctic? When does defensive, become offensive? And as I said, we talked to them in Syria about deconflicting, and I don't think it's rushing, the gun, rushing the race, to resume these mill-to-mill conflicts, mill-to-mill contacts. So I would just leave it there. We just probably disagree on this.
Ross, and then I'll go to Matt.
Sure. Thank you, Mike. Well, I want to return to just this concept that investments in science diplomacy and building capacity for meaningful work that improves the livelihoods of people living in the Russian Arctic and the U.S. Arctic and the Canadian Arctic are important, and those seem pretty well understood as to how we could do that and where that investment might go. And I think making sure that dialogue is supported and is strong. It's pretty clear. It's not high risk. It's important. People understand issues around environment and pollution and health. And so investing in those shows a concern for the region in general. And I can't tease apart the politics of geopolitics of mill-to-mill or these other opportunities, but I do think making sure that we're preserving this base of quality research, of engagement, of keeping the academic community connected to the diplomats and decision makers is really essential for the longer term progress and sustainability of the future Arctic. So I hope that we can continue this dialogue and find ways to even invite others in. But this, Mike, this has been absolutely wonderful. And I thank Jim for his comments and his vision already. And I look forward to hearing more and working with you. And Matt, I'll just thank you now too. And Mike, wonderful event. Thank you. Thank you, Wilson Center.
Thanks, Ross. Matt, we've got about a minute left. Maybe I'll ask you to take a little bit of that moment before I wrap up.
Okay, I'll do that because I can't resist. I'd say, look, if Jim is right, and I hope he is, that this is not going to be the locus of conflict, then let's push for transparency. Let's make sure that remains the case. Maximize transparency around the security conditions in the Arctic, especially with new stuff being built, restored, and moved into the region. And what we know is going to be a problem is disaster relief, especially with climate change. And we need to be coordinating on that because the stuff is bigger than any one area. Facebook, communications, other stuff with firefighters in Russia. We speak the same language and we love learning from one another. It really matters. So that works. Public health, already talked about. Science, couldn't agree more with Ross on that. And then finally, you know, Jim is probably right. The Arctic's not the solution to the bigger problems in the U.S.-Russia relationship. But if it's 20+% of Russian exports, you better believe the Russians care about getting back to some kind of normalcy in terms of commerce with the global economy in and out of the Arctic. And if we can emphasize our readiness to do that, if the clear conditions we've laid out for sanctions relief are met, then that needs to be right there at the very beginning of the Arctic conversation too. Otherwise, it's going to be overlooked and they're going to assume we're not serious about it.
Matt, thank you for that. It was a good way to end this. I want to thank who's still watching and for going over the 1 hour to 90 minutes, and it seems like we could have done another 90 minutes, which just tells me we need to continue a whole dialogue on these particular issues here. So Ken Yalowitz, thank you so much, my friend. Ross, same here. All colleagues and friends, I really appreciate it. Matt, thank you for spending the time with us and providing your insight. And Jim, thank you so much for your third day on the job to participate on the fly in this discussion. And we'll look forward to hopefully inviting you back. And we wish you the very best in your new position. Please call upon any of us to help as we might appropriately. And to all of those of you who have watched, thank you so very much. This recording, along with all of our programs, will be on the Wilson Center's Polar Institute website. I would encourage you to go back there. Once again, thank you very much. Matt, I think you and I have some work to do on some joint programming teased out. Again, Jim, us, and thank you to all my friends and colleagues on the panel, and to all of you out there, have a good rest of the day. Thank you very much.
Thank you.